flip it up.
Here we go. Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Steve Freeman from the Anti-Defamation League. It's a privilege and honor to be invited to moderate this first panel of the day. It's also a real treat. I kind of feel as if going back in time a little bit to be up here with AMAC and with Micah and with Kate. And I thought I would just start with a very brief description of what ADL is doing on this panel and why I was asked to do it. And then I'm going to let these three distinguished folks do most of the talking. But just to explain for those of you who don't know who ADL is and what we do and why I'm sitting here, we're an anti-hate organization that was founded in 1913, so probably compared to some of the other organizations on that co-sponsor list, we've been around a little longer. And we've been dealing with issues of hate online for 3 decades, going back to the days of dial-up and bulletin boards, and I remember we did our first report in the 1980s on poisoning the web. But obviously the concern changed in a significant way with the advent of social media about 10 years ago. And as an organization that gets lots of complaints from people, from constituents about anti-Semitism and about hate online, people would contact us and they would say, I just saw this video on YouTube that's hateful, and what are you guys doing about it? And we kind of looked at each other and said, we don't really know what to do about it. That prompted us to reach out to YouTube. And one of the first meetings we ever had on this subject about hate online and what companies are doing about it was actually at YouTube with Micah 10 years ago. And that started us down a path. It led to a conference, invitation-only conference that we had with the Stanford Law School Center on Internet and Society in 2010, and building relationships with the major tech companies. And our approach has been from the beginning, not that we agree with everything they say or everything they do or how they do things, but that we felt it was better to try to be constructive and try to collaborate and try to work together and offer suggestions for things that we thought they ought to consider. And so I think one of the things we're going to look at today, and one of the things this panel is going to do, is set the stage for what's changed, what's the same, how the issues have evolved over time. I'm going to ask each of the panelists to talk about several, call it 3 or 4 key points. The original attitude and understanding of a platform's responsibility to address or to ignore offensive content, and how the First Amendment plays into their thinking, how Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act plays into it, how the American worldview played into the company's early thinking about hate speech. So early approaches to content moderation, how those standards and those rules evolved over time, over the past decade or longer, how they were enforced and what's changed in methods of enforcement. So just generally the development of notice and takedown procedures, of an escalation process, of an appeals process, and then the benefit of hindsight. So here we are 10 years later. I look back at the agenda at that conference that we had at Stanford. Many of the things that we talked about there are still issues we're talking about today. I think we were talking about them quietly then, and the debate is much more public now. The issues we were raising with the companies were not front and center in terms of their priorities back then. It was, well, we have systems in place for reviewing content, and when we understand that there's an issue, I think if they would probably say today, well, the problem is much bigger than we thought it was going to be, and we're still figuring out the best ways to deal with it. And then I want to take a couple of minutes and ask everybody, both AMAC and Micah and Kate, to look ahead and sort of segue into the next session with what you guys think can be done differently, can be done better, is being done well. So with that, I'm not going to ask everybody. I'm not going to introduce each panelist. You have bios here. I am going to ask them to start by saying a couple of words about why they're sitting here, what their background is, what companies they worked with, and give us some of the history of their involvement, and hopefully include a couple of stories, because stories are some of the best parts of this. So AMAC, if you want to take it from there, I thank you very much, and thanks again to Kate and to all of you for hosting this and for inviting me to be part of this panel.
Yeah, this is first of all, this is just awesome that there are so many more people interested and engaged on these issues, and so many more smarter people. That this is a thing that really makes sense in an academic setting now, is a big deal for the people who are practicing. So first, just thank you to Kate and to Eric and to the folks that are organizing this community in such a great way. A little bit about me. So I'm Alex. Most people call me AMAC. the way I came into this really started working for an outside law firm to Google, and then I was at Google for a long time, did a ton of work with Google on its various products from a legal perspective, and then also from a sort of content policy perspective, moving the folks that were doing content moderation into the legal department, making them part of that broader group, and giving them hopefully more like tools and voice to get their jobs done. And then I moved to Twitter, was at Twitter for about 5.5 years, somewhere around there. Was their general counsel, also worked with Del Harvey, their incredible head of content moderation and trust and safety. And then went to the Obama White House thinking maybe I was done with content moderation for a little while. But within the Obama White House, we really took a focus to how the companies were thinking about doing terrorist content online, and how they were thinking about the ways in which terrorists were using those platforms. And were there ways that the government could be helpful, not thou shalt do X, Y, and Z, but hey, if you think you want to deal with ISIS on your platform, here's some stuff we know about how ISIS uses these platforms that might be helpful to you. Because in a lot of situations, governments have sometimes even better information than the platforms on what's going on for particular actors, particularly state actors and terrorist actors. So that's a little bit of my background. The story that I wanted to lead with was when I started thinking about these problems in law school and then after law school, it was sort of into a space that a lot of people were already working in. I remember particularly Heather Champ, who was doing Flickr's community guidelines and helping them form the great community that was Flickr. And Mary Worth, who was at Yahoo. It's no accident that a lot of the trailblazers here, a lot of the smartest folks are women. It, for some reason, is a place that a lot of women are drawn to, and there could be great conversation on that as well. But it was this wonderful group of early women who were doing this work that was the people who I was trying to understand what they were doing and learn from. The first time I really got involved was Google web search. We don't think of them as much in this space as we used to, but back in the day, Google web search was an important part of how we talked about content moderation and how we thought about the type of speech that should be available online. And Google web search had not been doing a lot of content removals. At that time, it was mostly people who were sort of accidentally in Google web search results because they didn't know how to use robots.txt, and so their son's 7th birthday party was all of a sudden appearing in Google web search, getting a lot of hits, and they didn't really want that to happen, so they would send an email to Google, and Google would the thing that they called it at the time was bad URLs. They would basically put that URL, that link, into a file that would mean it would get suppressed when it was returned in search results. One morning in March of 2002, Google put a site called Xenu.net into that bad URLs file. Xenu.net was still is a relatively popular Scientology criticism site. And one of the things that Scientology criticism sites do is they publish some of the secret texts of Scientology, which are the sort of preachings of Scientology. And they tend to be things you only get access to as a Scientologist if you have done a bunch of stuff within the Church of Scientology. And that usually also involves payment of a bunch of money. So these texts are things that the Scientologists guard quite zealously. And they had sent a DMCA takedown request to Google because Xenu.net was posting some of the chapters of these sacred texts of Scientology. And Google had taken a look at the DMCA request and decided that there was a there, that they were actually publishing some of these chapters, and had changed their bad URLs file to include the URL Xenu.net. And the way it worked was it was a wildcard match, so anything after Xenu.net would also be blocked. So what that meant was waking up in the morning in March of 2002, Xenu.net disappeared from Google. And for a lot of people, it meant Xenu.net disappeared from their ability to find it online. And the internet community was, pissed, quite rightly pissed, because they felt like this was Google taking sides in a debate about Scientology. They felt like Google had made a mistake and blocked this site when they only needed to maybe block the chapters at most. They felt like Google was doing something that was wrong. And so there was this big thread on Slashdot. I don't know if you all remember Slashdot, but that used to be a really big deal. And a big thread on Slashdot about how wrong Google was. And what it prompted the folks at Google to do was two things that we'll probably talk about sort of further in this panel. But one was to think through this specific request and make changes to how they process the specific request. So relatively quickly, ZNU.net on the whole was back up, even though some of the chapters were not, the chapter pages were not in the index. But the pointer to ZNU.net came back. There was no more ZNU.net disappearing, it still existed. But also it prompted the people who were doing that work, at the time engineers, it prompted them to think about whether this policy was a good policy. In other words, whether just putting something in this bad URLs list and having it disappear was the right way to do it, or whether there could be some way in which they could be more transparent. And I had worked a little bit with Wendy Seltzer on chillingeffects.org, which is now the Lumens database, a great site for academic research, but also so that people can know what's going on in this space. And so what we did was we ended up creating a way for the Google web search to return the results without some of these ZNU.net chapters, but including a link to what the reason for the takedown was and also what had been taken down. So you had a way of understanding that you were getting to search and still get your results. You weren't finding this result, and here's why. Here was why. And that, so with the two things I want to identify there is what Kate calls this in her piece is sort of the common law aspect of trying to make decisions on particular cases, but also the broader sort of structural aspect of, okay, how do you rethink the entire way we go about doing this? Anyway, that's probably plenty of me talking. So.
No, that's awesome. Thank you so much. This is such an amazing conference already. I'm just so happy to be here. I missed the last two and was so sad. And so, yeah. So my name is Micah. I started at YouTube right at the end of 2005, beginning of 2006, when it was about a dozen people above a pizza parlor in San Mateo. And we didn't have in-house counsel. We barely had places to sit. You had to build your own desk. That was the initiation. When then someone would join, you pick the next IKEA desk off the stack and take the next spot on the wall. And in terms of content moderation, it was really ad hoc, right? Chad Hurley, the co-founder and CEO, spent a lot of time just on the site during the day. If you saw something that didn't seem right, or it was just kind of maybe not content that we wanted to be on the main page or to bubble up to the top, someone might just kind of take it down, and it was really really casual. And pretty quickly, then maybe a few weeks, a month of my joining, as the service was really taking off, we're like, all right, we need the flagging system. We should have a review queue, and then pretty soon after that, okay, we should probably hire someone to actually be dedicated just to this, because it was getting distracting. And so that was kind of the origin of the first time we had to actually codify the content policies or even guidelines in writing. And so I put together a one-page outline that was just super high level of just trying to articulate sort of what had already evolved organically of just sort of the common thinking of those of us who had already been kind of removing things. And we It ended up kind of being by just default under like a customer support kind of organization, because that's, all there was. We weren't marketing, we weren't business development, and we weren't engineering. So it was kind of like an operations team. And we modeled it a lot off of, I think everybody borrowed a lot from eBay. They were the first ones, I think, that even called it like a trust and safety team. And we talked to our friends, talked to Chris Kelly a lot, and who was the chief privacy officer at Facebook, who's dealing with a lot of these kinds of issues. And his wife, Jennifer Carrico, actually worked with us in the early days. She's a lawyer, and it was really instrumental in helping to kind of like help us figure out, like, okay, cool, you've got this one pager. How can we like put some more structure around that and actually, make it more granular and have rules that can be interpreted and implemented in a uniform way. AMAC mentioned Flickr. I think they were someone that we really looked to a lot as an example, as a company that had done a really good job of establishing norms for their user community early on, and how that benefited them all through the life of that service. You had a lot of services where you could share or post photos, right? And it's like, what differentiated Flickr from like a photo bucket or just like your MySpace wall? And it was really kind of a clean space. It really catered towards like amateur and pro-am and professional photographers, like clean, nice things. And it was really, I think, owed a lot to their hands-on approach. They had a real idea of like who the service was for, and you'd go there and you would see the type of content that they wanted to foster, and that would encourage you to be like, okay, I'll post things like that. And they did a good job of quarantining or kind of filtering out things. You could have stuff that's not safe for work, but you weren't likely to stumble across it if you weren't seeking it out, or if you had opted out and said, I don't want to see mature content. And another one that we looked to a lot was, I think LiveJournal was a good example. So if you think of kind of the evolution of social networking services and blogging services and user-generated content, a lot of that started in the early days of like LiveJournal, right? It was blogging before we called it blogging. And then you had Friendster, which bootstrapped off of MySpace, right? Like you needed the social graph. You had people on LiveJournal. They spread out their code of like so you could like get the early access to Friendster. And in turn, YouTube was bootstrapping off of MySpace. You could embed YouTube videos. And so that's where a lot of the early traffic came to. And these were all patterns that we actively talked about in those very early days of, how do you leverage that, but also how do you foster a good user community? Primarily for growth, but also then thinking about ahead and thinking about the things we're dealing with what types of content do we want to allow. How's that going to affect our ability to scale? How's that going to affect things of like, okay, we don't want to turn into a porn site. We want to be able to monetize. We may need to get acquired someday, or succeed in all these fronts that wouldn't be like super compatible with for our goals. And you would look at MySpace and compare it to Friendster, and it was like their success was owed in large part of that Friendster was really prescriptive. You had boxes you could fill in, but there was like no personalization. And MySpace was like the opposite. They threw over there like you can make your page as blinky as you want with animations, and people did. But people also posted all kinds of lowbrow or racy content on MySpace, and that became the aesthetic, and that became the norm for MySpace. And their content moderation was, people people weren't flagging stuff a lot on MySpace, because you go there and you see stuff like that, and that's just kind of the norm. And so it wouldn't occur to you to report something that on something like Facebook might seem more inappropriate. And MySpace had to outsource a lot of that. So they had folks in, I think, Florida and the Philippines who ostensibly were doing content review, but they were really more like glorified flaggers, right? They're paying hundreds or thousands of people to go through and flag things. And then the next day at MySpace in Los Angeles, people from the core team would wake up, see the stuff that'd been flagged and start taking it down. But the turnaround time was like 8 hours to 24 hours. And so that doesn't encourage people to flag content, right? Because you flag it and nothing happens, and there's just tons of it everywhere you look. So you just assume this is what MySpace is for. And so those were, I think, some of the really formative things that kind of went into our soup of okay, how are we going to approach this? And our focus was really on speed of review. We'd get a lot, we'd meet with folks like Steve and others, and always get the question how many people do you have reviewing content? And our answer was always, well, for most content, it's reviewed within an hour of being reported to us. And that was our standard of this is a responsible approach. And I don't know how much I can keep going. I can get into, it would be good now to get into our principles and stuff. Keep going with it. All right. So, so as we were, let's see. So that was kind of our first policies. And then about 10 months later, we did get acquired by Google. And it was really interesting. After we got acquired, and there was a lot, we were kind of relieved, I think, and AMAC could probably talk about this, someone who's on the other side of that transaction. One of the first things they did was they wanted to see our content policies and things like that as part of the diligence process, right? Do you guys have your act together? Google had Google Video. YouTube was, I think much more perception of being much more raw, much more kind of closer to a free-for-all than Google Video, which had hours delay when you upload something because they were doing so much proactive review, whereas you could post something on YouTube, it would go up right away. A lot of our early policies, we were actually being extra conservative because of that perception. We were consciously aware, okay, we can't afford to take as strong a position on certain types of speech because we're more worried about obscenity law or prosecutions, right? Because we just didn't have the resources or the reputation and goodwill to take those kinds of risks. And so there were areas where Google Video, once we kind of compared notes and joined up together, we could see okay, cool, you guys took more, they had a more liberal policy for S&M and like BDSM bondage content, right? Because if you look at older precedents and older obscenity law, there was more stuff around S&M might be more likely to be considered obscenity in certain jurisdictions, and we're we're just not gonna touch it. But it was really interesting to see how much of our policies actually just completely organically, independently evolved to be really similarly structured. And I don't know how much of that was getting inspiration from some of the same services, everyone looking to, Flickr or LiveJournal or whoever. And some of it I just think was just natural coevolution. But the main principles that I used when we would be considering a new policy or just thinking about what are the goals and kind of way of analyzing a new policy. And it was 3 major categories of legal, user experience, and kind of a catch-all for business interests. And so the legal analysis, it's pretty Non-controversial, right? Your service has to comply with applicable laws. So that gets more complicated as you start to launch internationally, and you have to figure out how you're going to comply with laws in different countries and which ones you're subjected to. Which countries, is there a strong rule of law? Is it ethical? Is it in keeping with your values to, adopt that country's, interpretation of their laws and what's permissible? But for, most issues, it's fairly straightforward, right? Child exploitation. That's an example of yes, it's unlawful. It's one of the few categories of content that is unlawful in the U.S. But all right, well, we probably don't need to, rely just on the fact that it's illegal to know that we don't want it on our service, right? So that brings you to user experience, right? How is this going to impact the user community, this type of content? And so for that, we'd look at both what people are posting, right? Because that's a vote in favor of what that content is. But then also, are people reporting it? Are people complaining about it? How is it affecting the norms of the user community? And our goal there was to maximize free expression and the most diverse amount of content possible. That was kind of our starting point for user experience, was just how do we let all this crazy, desperate, totally different content coexist on the same platform in a healthy way. And that led to sort of this concept of that there are categories of content that are hostile content, and it doesn't mean that they express hostility, but they're hostile to peacefully coexisting alongside a diverse range of expression. And so one category of that would be, say, racy content, right? So things that are maybe sexually provocative, but they're not rising to the level of pornography. They're not something that we've decided we need to remove. But if you go to the YouTube, browse pages or kind of leaderboard of the most popular videos, and it's been totally overrun with Sports Illustrated swimsuit edition style thumbnails, and you might, even if you are okay, I'm into it, I want to see this, you might not want to see it when you're not looking for it. Or you might say, you know what, okay, I see what this site's about. Maybe it's not the best place for my cat videos. And so being mindful that there were certain types of content that would edge out other content. And so the other one that I think was like that is hate speech, radical content, content that is the shock and gore kind of faces of death content, where again it's can be disturbing. It might be okay, there might be places for it on your service, but if you're stumbling across it when you're not looking for it, or if it's there to the exclusion of other content, right? That's an interest you need to balance, of this idea of okay, you're maximizing free expression, but you also want to maximize, diversity. You don't want to have that chilling effect on other types of content. And then the third category, business interests, and that's everything from, we got the realities of you want to have the ability to monetize your service. You need to stay in business. You need to perhaps be able to get acquired if that's, your business interests. And social responsibility was part of that, right? So we're thinking about the hate speech policy. We're thinking about where are the contours of this speech, and one of the elements was, in a sense, what can you get away with, right? What can you justify at the end of the day? There's what can you get away with in terms of user experience, which leads you to do things like labeling content or having filters. So you can say, okay, this content is racy, we're going to age gate it, or we're going to quarantine it so it's not showing up in search results as high or on browse pages, but you can still find it. And then you have to say, well, where's the line of content that we can just restrict which is essentially, and we didn't realize this at the time, but now looking back and seeing where things are today is like, it's the recipe for creating filter bubbles, right? You say, okay, this content, we're going to quarantine it, and it's not going to offend people, and advertisers won't see it, and people won't complain because the only people seeing it are people who want to. And what that misses is that third bucket of social responsibility of, well, what's defensible? I still have to go out and talk to people, and I still have to, we're still going to be hosting this content. And so there's some of it that, yeah, maybe you just kind of sweep it under the rug, you keep it in the long tail. It's like if it bubbles up as an issue, then we'll address it. And that was, I think, kind of the frame of mind that went into a lot of those kind of early policy discussions.
Okay. So I did not work for YouTube, Facebook, or Twitter. I was like 13 when this was happening. But I was an early adopter of Friendster and LiveJournal. But I'm here in part to talk because Charlotte and Dave Wilner, who were early people that worked at Facebook on forming their content moderation policy, were actually not able to be here today. But I have had dozens upon dozens of interviews with them at this point and have written extensively about their experiences. And if I had done this properly, I would have grown a beard so I look like Dave and had a Henley shirt and be surrounded by a pack of adopted dachshunds. But I didn't prepare enough for this. But I think that if Dave was here, Dave and Charlotte started at Facebook around 2008, at which point it was, as everyone has described here, a very small and couple, I think less than a dozen people that were doing content moderation for Facebook. At that point, Facebook was primarily an American site used by American college-age students, and recent college grads from America were exactly the people that were policing the content moderation. Micah used the term proactive versus reactive. I think that that's a great term. It kind of describes exactly how a lot of content moderation takes place. There is not a lot of proactive content moderation in general, except in the area, as far as I can tell, of extremist speech. And that's maybe slowly changing in the last couple of years, but especially at the beginning, there was just too much. It was like a fire hose. And so the people did use what I call reactive content moderation, which was that they would flag it and then they would get put into a queue and they would build these types of review mechanisms to be able to review content. And so that was kind of what people were doing. And at Facebook at the time, the rule was, and this is Dave and Charlotte's words, not mine, if it makes you feel bad, take it down. That was basically the entire ethos of taking down content on Facebook. But that's in kind of in lawyer speak, that is a standard, not a rule. A rule would be don't drive over 35 miles per hour, and a standard would be don't drive too fast. So this was a don't drive too fast standard. And that works when you have a small community where everyone understands what too fast means. But it stops working when you start having diversity in a large group and you start to grow at scale, which is exactly what Facebook started to do. And suddenly what made one type of group or segment of population or culture comfortable was a very different thing from what made other situations comfortable. And they started to have to outsource and some of their content moderation to people who did not have the same types of norms as the vast majority of Facebook users. So Dave and Dave had started already doing this, was to create kind of, as Micah had described, kind of AMAC has described like kind of a basic list of rules to use to create, and they did it in a wiki doc, incidentally, which I think is kind of interesting. And it went from being in 2008, like one page of like Nazis are bad, take down Nazi stuff. We obviously no child pornography, and things like that, to kind of a very sophisticated level of rules that you could train. As one moderator once told, or as one manager once told me, you could train someone who had grown up in the Amazon on these rules, and they would be able to tell you what art was under Facebook's definition, whether or not they'd ever seen Michelangelo's David, right? And so this was kind of in part what they were trying to do. It ended up turning into, I think at various points, the internal rules were kind of like around 80 pages. And I say internal rules because they're not internal anymore. Facebook has made them transparent, and it has done a really great job of putting them up on its site and kind of integrating them into the larger community standards. But for a long time, there were community standards that said things like no impermissible nudity or no overly sexual nudity. And it was unclear what exactly was meant by that. And it was unclear to everyone except the people who were trained on the rules within the company that were doing the content moderation. And so I think that one of kind of the interesting stories about the kind of a thing like Michelangelo's David, and how you train someone who like lived in the Philippines and has never maybe seen David, or any idea, is how do you tell them that that is permissible art and not nudity, right? Like, how do you make that clear? And one of the things that Dave told me was, he was like, well, you make a rule of things that you can physically see in the picture, that you can that are like actually observable, because it can't be cultural assumptions based on something. So for example, the rule for art became, is it made out of wood? Is it made out of metal? Is it made out of stone? Is it made out of like something else? And that became the definition of art, which is not a perfect definition, as we all know. That is a kind of like a rudimentary definition, right? It doesn't really capture the essence of art. Certainly doesn't capture the essence of art. But as Dave said, the goal wasn't to get it right, it was to get it the least wrong as possible. And so I think that was kind of a nice example of that, that there was very much this idea that they were going to put these things in place, and sure, there were going to be mistakes, there were going to be errors. The one other thing that I would mention is that the fact that these rules were developed by Dave and Judd and a number of other people at Facebook, they were kind of, and I think that they'll tell you this, they would say this, they were developed during a time in like 2008 to 2010, and as Steve has said, this was a time when people were not widely talking about this. This was not a huge topic, and one of the reasons, and I hope we get to talk about it a little bit here, is how content moderation moved from being a customer service issue into a part of the product, and a really core part of the product that people were working on and kind of aware. And I think a lot of that has to do with scale, because once it became very clear that you could mess up content moderation quite so bad that it could just completely tank like your PR reputation for 2.5 weeks, there really became a different emphasis on how much time and effort the companies started putting into this and how seriously they took it, I think. The one last thing that I will say that goes to the conference that Steve hosted through ADL. That was one of the early conferences that brought together all of these companies that were doing content moderation and had been working to come up with their policies and had not been talking to each other. And I think Micah kind of mentioned this briefly, that it was really interesting that there was this kind of like convergence. Dave described this to me and that moment at that conference, and I love this metaphor. He was like, it was kind of like seeing convergent evolution. Everyone had grown wings. Some people had bat wings. Some people had bird wings. Some people had dragonfly wings. Some people had roach wings and were still skittering on the ground. But like everyone had done this, and it was all different ways of doing content moderation, but like they had all kind of come to their own thing. Since then, I think there's been a lot of cross-pollination within these companies of people that are good at content moderation and have struggled to kind of figure it out, and they get sucked up by the next company that really needs someone good to do content moderation, and they cross-pollinate a lot of those policies over. But I do think that that was kind of like an interesting moment that Steve, helped kind of create, was just this first moment of all of these people coming together to talk about these policies.
Thanks.
Do you mind if I react to that just a little bit? Because I do think there's definitely something different about this moment that we're in, especially with the current social media companies. But I don't think these companies either never got together or never saw each other before. I mean, even ADL, right? We were doing meetings with ADL in 03, 04. Because there were interesting content policy issues. It was just a different set of platforms that were popular at that time.
Sure. Yeah.
And I guess the other thing that I would push on is, to me, like, the reason why Google Video and YouTube looked pretty similar is because they were trying to build the same product, right? Like, they weren't trying to build two different things. One wasn't trying to be a dinner party and the other a circus carnival. They were both trying to be video services where you would host your videos that were the cat videos all the way through to your latest music video. And I do think what sometimes I like the way Dave put that, or the way you put it in Dave's voice, because I think too often we think about these things as if there's like one correct content policy that everybody should do. And that's not been my experience. The difference between Orkut and Google Web Search, or Twitter and Club Penguin, these are very different things that people are trying to do. And at the end of the day, the content policy is about what you're trying to do, what you're trying to help your users experience. So that's one thing. And then I think the other thing, which is which comes across very much in your writing on this, is that these policies are also not static. So even if you had a service that you wanted to build and you could write the perfect content policies for that service, those content policies will evolve over time, because these services are, I think the companies get a lot of probably good ribbing for calling them communities when oftentimes it's really like, not from the company's perspective a community, but a group of consumers. But there is something to that idea of a growing community, or whatever other word you want to use instead of that. This is something that does change over time. So for example, the original Twitter content policies were all about private information, impersonation, parody accounts, because that's what Twitter was being used for. That was the thing. Just like eBay, all of its stuff a lot of it was about trademark and counterfeit goods, because that's what a lot of the people were trying to use it for, and eBay wanted to kind of like bring it back. And so you both, not only is there not one content policy to rule them all that we should be going to go do, but also there isn't one static thing that exists in a vacuum and is not about the current moment in time and the current composition of the system. I think MySpace was really, as Micah said, was really a proof point of the content policies determine to a large extent what your product is. Between like the great example of Flickr and the, I think, less good example of MySpace, you had this dynamic of knowing that a really good content policy with a great community manager could do a lot of good in terms of product definition, service definition, and building that. And that, I think, is true, from the early days of CompuServe and AOL, all the way up until the very newest products.
Yeah.
It would be interesting to have, if you don't mind, talk a little bit more about Twitter and about the early thinking. You talked about how content policies evolve, and Twitter may be one of the best examples of that kind of evolution. But the early conversations at Twitter about this when it came up, and the sort of the mindset of the folks who were there at the time when you were there, what I think would be interesting to
Yeah, sure. And I should say, like, I joined Twitter in '09, so I wasn't quite the earliest of early. There was a woman named Del Harvey who is amazing, Delbius on Twitter, has done a good TED talk about this content policy stuff that is worth a watch. But the thing to remember is back then Twitter was was just smaller, a lot less important than it is today, and was not necessarily about the same types of things that it is about today. When Twitter first reached out to me to be their general counsel, I kind of thought it was a bad idea and said no, because I thought it was all about the Kardashians and what people had for lunch. And that wasn't interesting to me as a thing to be involved in. It was only when I started to realize that people were having political discussions on Twitter, that people were finding communities that they wouldn't otherwise find on Twitter. One of the things that Twitter has been really, really brilliant at is giving space for marginalized communities to find their voices and to organize. Unfortunately, a lot of, some at least, marginalized communities were marginalized for very good reason. And we definitely see that power extends across some groups that I wish were gone. But the early Twitter stuff was really around how do we think about the types of uses that people are making of the platform that were parody or that were criticism or that were anonymity or political discourse in foreign countries where we didn't have employees. So how do we support that? We also had, I think there's a blurry line between content policies and user protection policies. And often the trust and safety groups that are responsible for both are together. So what I mean by user protection policies are things like, how do you deal with a government request for the information of a user? How do you deal with if this was on the handout, you can see like an ad for a different article on the Shitty Men media list, right? How do you deal with someone who's looking to expose an anonymous set of comments to a particular document? That also is part of how your users think about the type of community that you're building and the type of product that they are engaging with. So for us at that time, a lot of it was how do we think about those types of controversies and how do we deal with that? And we hadn't yet gotten to the level of importance in the society that the product certainly is at now. It would have been pretty inconceivable to us in '09 and certainly to the people in '08 that the amount of campaigning, for example, that is currently happening on Twitter in the U.S. for the U.S. election, let alone all over the rest of the world. And those content policies have evolved over time as Twitter has become more important in that respect.
Yeah, you mentioned a couple things about kind of the idea of like having like a monolithic user community, or even the idea that we call it a community. And I know sometimes there'll be pushback around that, and it made me kind of think about kind of like how we thought about that is like when you have a service that has slow organic growth or just steady organic growth, you're able to establish norms in a different way, right? Because new users show up, they might post things that are like not in keeping with the vibe of that service, and they'll kind of get corrected, right? It's like if you join a subreddit, is probably the modern example, right? Where they have like, if it's a healthy, robust subreddit, on you got moderators and they've got rules, and if you post off topic or whatever, you'll probably get corrected by somebody pretty quickly, and you get sort of indoctrinated into the culture of that space that you're in. So, when you think about a huge service and something as diverse as Twitter or Facebook or YouTube, and you're kind of like, well, it doesn't have that community vibe. Like, how can you have like one community concept in that way for a service like that? And, in the very earliest days of YouTube, we still felt like the traffic, we still had millions of users, but you could sense the trends a lot more readily, right? We'd have, a spike in traffic, and we'd suddenly get more reports of abuse. And the spike of traffic might be, linked to, oh, we were on like Good Morning America, and now more people are on the service. Things that you would never even like perceive of, and when you're at a much larger scale. And we get more abuse because it's new users who don't know what's expected on the platform, and then they would get absorbed into the culture, into the community of the service. But when you're experiencing hypergrowth, it gets much, much more difficult, if not impossible, to absorb those new users.
It's almost like
Usenet,
when
Permanent
AOL
November.
opened up Usenet.
That's it.
Sorry.
What was it? Was it Permanent December?
Yeah.
Is that what they call it? Yeah. So this was
Permanent September.
September.
Freshman.
Because they were back to school. Yes. So it was early days of Usenet. It was like it was all like hardcore nerds and people who had access to internet already through like either the BBS they're on or the university, and every time new freshmen would come in, it was just like, the unwashed hordes came in, and they'd have to get indoctrinated into the culture. I think there was an equivalent on BBSs. Maybe that's what I think December, because kids would get modems for Christmas. And so right around Christmas time, you'd get like this influx of like 13-year-olds being obnoxious. And so this is all a long way of winding up to like, where did YouTube comments go so wrong, right? Comment sections on your YouTube videos were just from day one notorious cesspools, right? We never
read the comments.
Yeah, and there's way more like moderation kind of tools now, but it took so long even to get there. And if you think about it, of like how healthy communities evolved, right? LiveJournal, certain subreddits, right? And it's like, and then you're like, okay, each video is its own little micro community of people that are on the service for totally different reasons, right? You've got like the person who's really there for the knitting videos and the person who's really there for the anti-Semitism, and they're both converging on the kitten falling asleep video. And
Charlotte actually has a really funny story about the really weird, she works at Pinterest now, about the really weird like convergence of like white supremacy and like bunt pans cookings, and like people that share, like there's this weird crossover of people who share like baking recipes and then also white supremacy videos.
Nazis gotta eat.
But I would just to cut in really quickly, one of the things that I think we're kind of describing in this kind of way is like the rapidity in which norms develop online, and the ability of the internet to create centralized communities out of what was traditionally decentralized communities because of geography. And so like all of these little like the Usenet things, like you're describing, like it's basically like, well, you have this nice little town and everyone understands like what the rules are, and then all of a sudden like a horde of 13-year-olds shows up and they have a different idea of what that town's gonna look like, but that happens over and over and over again. And so I think that there's something, that's kind of, that also goes back to what you were saying about just and what I talk about sometimes about the common law nature of this. You can't have a static set of anything, because who knows what Twitter is going to be used for in 2 years, let alone 8, right? When we wouldn't have ever foreseen this. Who would have thought MySpace would disappear, or AOL, or all of these kind of these types of these structures? And so I think that there's the fluidity in which, and the rapidity that you have to develop and stay on top of these rules, and creating and updating these rules is just a huge, it is I think it is the problem. It is the difficult thing. Do you want to?
No, I want to ask a question for you, Kate.
Oh, yeah.
And then we'll take some questions from the
Sure.
audience. You want to speak a little bit to the significance of the fact that the people who were formulating these policies were all basically American trained, ingrained in the First Amendment, and the idea of of hate speech is protected with certain exceptions, and now obviously these platforms exploded very quickly from being American focused to being international, but still the people who are creating these rapidly changing guidelines are still, that's the framework in which they sort of approach it.
Yeah,
Which I think is important to to.
I feel we were talking about it with like both. I mean,
were
both
a
of you
little
were part of. I mean, both of you were two of the people that kind of were doing this. But that one of the things that I wrote about in doing kind of this historical overview of how all of this developed is that a lot of the people that were working on these policies were, if they were not First Amendment lawyers or media lawyers in some capacity, they certainly were American citizens who kind of had this normative free speech value that they took into their policies. And there was a very robust belief in keeping up as much speech as possible and then taking down, and then depending on the platform, weighing how you protected your user, how you pushed back against governments that wanted you to take down certain stuff, how you didn't push back against governments that wanted you to take down certain stuff, the type of content that you pushed back on. And so I think that that's a really important backdrop, that if all of these companies had developed, I don't know, in the Netherlands or Thailand, that this might be a very different we might be having a very different conversation. And that there was something also, frankly, and I think this is often talked about, which is about the kind of techno-utopian, libertarian moment that was happening in Silicon Valley when these companies were emerging, and the culture that created to kind of foment some of these initial kind of foundational rules and kind of standards around some of these ideas.
There is some like survivorship and availability bias to that, though.
Yeah.
Like there were a lot of competitors, even to YouTube, for example, that were developed in Europe. The Google video is a great example, right? The fact that we were pre-screening every video before we put it on the site was a very different way of doing content policies that lost, like, abysmally, incredibly, awesomely, like and a lot of the foreign approaches to these types of problems, unless there's some significant language barrier. So you look at Naver and some of the properties in South Korea, and you do really have a different approach that is still thriving in those places, or unless it was real thumb on the scale from government. Like Baidu and Weibo and the other Chinese approaches to this it's not that they didn't exist or that people didn't try them. It's just that they didn't survive. They didn't accumulate users the way the American ones did.
Yeah.
Okay, I have a few questions that have come in that I'm going to throw at you. First one, seems like early content moderation policies were based on what the designers and managers themselves thought crossed a line. What was it that provoked the platforms to start thinking about other communities of users who were unlike them and the problem moderating on their behalf?
Well, I mean, I probably challenged the premise a little bit. I think we were really, first and foremost, responding to the user community. What was the content being posted, and what were the behaviors on the service, and what were their impacts on the service and on our business. So that's why AMAC was saying, right, the policies would constantly have to evolve, right? And we started in a place of least restrictiveness, knowing that it's kind of a one-way ratchet, and it's very difficult to make things more liberal once you've created a restriction and an expectation. So I think that really guided a lot of it, was seeing like, okay, we're going to start off with like a really lenient hate speech policy. Like the first idea of our hate speech policy, and if you use the Internet Archive's Wayback Machine, which I encourage everyone to do, it's really interesting, you can see the evolution over time of all of the platforms' community guidelines. And so, the first hate speech policy we're like, okay, what's the kind of the minimum here that can be objectively enforced with like real bright line rules. And it really boiled down to you could say anything, no matter how abhorrent, as long as you didn't use like slurs or stereotypes to do it. So it was like, basically like you can be, super offensive. Just don't be too rude about it, which is a terrible, I think, start. But it was only in place for a couple months, right? And you can look in the Wayback Machine and see a few months later where that policy was added to with kind of a broad catch-all about content that like demeans or defames folks on the basis of their membership in a protected class. And that's a good example of kind of evolving with it. We're like, okay, we'll start off like as hands-off as we can and see what kind of content we come across, see what's bubbling up. And most of this content was in the long tail, right? It wasn't bubbling up. You didn't have the algorithmic promotion that is so pervasive today that I think is taking content that used to be on the fringes, that used to be, you're not going to get rid of all the content. You're going to have some stuff you don't come across or it doesn't get bubbled up that's in the long tail, but it could do limited damage in the long tail. And even if people shared it and it went a little bit viral, when things went viral 10 years ago, it was individuals deliberately making a choice to share that content with somebody else and passing through word of mouth. The algorithms of today that take those small trends and pour gas on them, I think completely flip the dynamic of how content moderation is done. And I think a lot of times those algorithms are being developed by completely different people in the organization, right? With not a lot of visibility from other parts of it. So we're on the policy or trust and safety and operations side, like agonizing over like, okay, if we allow this speech, like what's that gonna do to like our review queues and what's that gonna do to the user community? And meanwhile, you have some engineer on the other side of the company just doing with completely different, they're on a growth team and their metrics for success are completely different. And they're probably, and to give credit, very smart people who are thinking about the product in a holistic way, but thinking about it on, their piece of it. And I think a lot of times and it's maybe less true today now than it was in the past. There's an expectation early on for the operations teams to kind of just like pick up the slack. Like we're going to surface all this content from the long tail, and so we can get more people seeing the stuff they want to see, and just the idea of like, we'll just like take down the bad stuff. And it's really, if you're not building up the automation and the tools and the resources for review, and suddenly you're surfacing more bad stuff, obviously, I think that's what's led to a lot of the challenges we've seen just even like the last 6 months in the space, kind of all of that coming to a head of, being able to keep up with that.
I can't wait to see the animated GIF of Micah imitating an engineer programming. That's going to be.
It's also
really
the Swedish
special.
chef.
I just wanted to add really quickly that I think the question was about how did we start thinking about users that didn't look like us, and I think the biggest thing there was the conversations that we had with user groups and advocacy organizations, and many of them are in the audience today, were always really valuable. So like every conversation I ever had with EFF about other things we should be considering were really valuable. Kevin Bankston, who's in the audience today, also was constantly pushing us to consider things that we weren't considering. The value of those types of conversations and how important it was made it really clear that they were important. And same with ADL, right? Like we would learn things all the time, and that was addictive.
And internationalization was a big part of all of that, of figuring out, how are you going to localize these policies to, different cultural expectations around the world.
AMAC just anticipated one of the other questions here, which was about relations with civil society groups, like the ones with some of the co-sponsors here. But I guess the question was the nature of the interaction and whether it was. I know from my experience that we often came to the companies, but I don't know internally whether there were decisions about who to go to get some outside thought, commentary, reactions to policies you were considering. I don't know if that was something that was in the early stages contemplated, or that tended to be more once you started hearing from people, you said this could be a useful way to help us think this through. So maybe you want to share some of the insights.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you try to issue spot. You do that imperfectly. That's when the groups come to you. But if you've issue spotted well, then you start thinking about, like a good example of this. It's not quite user-generated content, but when Google Street View was rolling out, of course we were going to talk to Cindy Southworth because she had a lot of understanding of what it would mean for a rape crisis center to be visible on Google Street View, and how could we deal with that issue. And we had our own hypotheses, but she's dealing with those issues. She was dealing with those issues every day. So of course you want to talk to the people who are dealing with those issues every day. So there is like both issue spotting and I think after the fact mistake correcting, which also brings you back to the more transparent and responsive you can be, the better.
Did you want to speak to that? Okay.
Everything he said.
Okay. So the last question, and then I'm going to give each of you a chance to say a last word. The last question is really kind of I guess I'm paraphrasing. It's a hindsight question, or maybe it's a question for somebody else who wants to try to get into these space now, which is, would setting community norms early help prevent bad content, or will the bad guys come anyway? And that's sort of an opportunity to look back and say, should we have done this differently? Should we have thought about these at the very beginning in the way that we didn't? Obviously, hindsight 2020, it sort of didn't evolve that way for obvious reasons. But should new companies that want to go forward start by having very strict content policies as one of the foundational things that they do? And would that, looking back, so this is sort of aimed at going to sort of looking back and looking forward. Where does that fit in the sort of the thought process and the planning process for anybody who wants to try to create new opportunities for social media?
That's a great question. I think it's very hard as a new product that you may not even have any users yet. You may have some idea of what you're trying to build or what you expect to see, but it's very, very difficult to create content policies in a vacuum. I think it's always wise to start off with some kind of a sane foundation. Particularly for, there's always going to be things that are off the bat, like, okay, well, this is definitely, bad, and we don't want this, or you can, look around at the industry, and there's a lot more awareness, obviously, now about what types of things you can expect to encounter, and you should launch with something reasonable, but also you're not under the same kind of scrutiny as big platforms when you're first launching, right? You're an entrepreneur. You don't know if is anyone even going to use this product? There's usually kind of in the past, there was a reluctancy to put too much effort into any of this. Now you're seeing kind of an overcorrection of people being like, okay, I have an idea for a user-generated content platform. What should my exact hate speech policy be? And it's which is refreshing, I think, probably for a lot of people in this room, that people are so aware now. And it's great stuff to be thinking about early, but also you don't want to get too ahead of yourself. Start with something sane, and then you have to see how it applies to your specific product. Your demographics might surprise you, and the demographics of your early user community does a lot to set the tone for what that service is. If you have, a service like I worked at Snapchat for a long time, and one of the differences there from other places I worked was young people, right? It's really young focused. It was majority female, so we were more likely to have issues with self-harm and eating disorder content than hate speech, right? And so those are the kinds of things that you might not know going into it, but you have to evolve with the product.
Last chance before, as a segue to what we're going to be talking about the rest of the day, which is issues today. Any lessons learned? Any comments that you think you want to end this session with?
Yeah, I think kind of continuing that vein of the idea that policies have to evolve. I think there's a lot of stuff that the groundwork got laid early on, and some of that institutional knowledge gets lost as the companies grow, and they get attached. They become sort of their own myth making, right? Their own like internal company dogma of this is what we do, and this is what we believe in, and it's not always accurate, right? Like we made a lot of these policies thinking like, no, these are going to change. Sometimes it's when we have more resources. Sometimes it's, the neo-Nazi content is in the long tail. We'll deal with it as it bubbles up. If it gets too visible and too out of control, like we're going to have to like dial things up and do something about it. And so I think I'd really encourage companies today who are now grappling with these issues of content that used to be much more stigmatized, used to be on the fringes, that is now coming to the forefront where, we were worried about persuasion, and now the risk is around normalization, which is a different threat model. And they benefit from association with your brand. They benefit from adjacency with other content that gives legitimacy, right? People aren't talking about, which conspiracy theorists are being banned from Vimeo, right? They're worried about which ones are being banned from Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube, and that's because of the distribution they provide. It's because of the legitimacy of the adjacency of the content. They're free riding on that community that was built on content that was like specifically not them, right? There's this entitlement we're hearing in the rhetoric, in the discourse of like, oh yeah, you're a free speech platform. Of course you should allow all of this. What about me? What about this content? You allow that. And I would push back on that and say, no, these platforms are successful in spite of your presence. In fact, like explicitly because steps were taken early on to shape it as a place where hostile content isn't welcome. And so to the extent that algorithmic promotion has sort of flipped things and that just the perception of what the platforms are for, I think people should take a step back and take real ownership and say, no, like we should be neutral in that we should be fair, but not neutral at the cost of principles, right? You shouldn't be neutral on genocide. I think that's probably a good place to end
Neutral
it.
and genocide.
I don't think I can top that, right? Anyone disagree? Anyone want to fight me on that?
I was going to say, I just Dana Boyd, who is very wise on many of these things and has a lot of great things to say about this. I'm just very briefly, your words make me think of like, you have a right to free speech or you have a right to speech, but you do not have a right to amplification. Yes. And I think that is a really important kind of message to think about in relation to kind of exactly what you said.
Yeah, 100%.
Thank you all very much, and thank you all very much.
So we have a 15-minute break, and then we're going to have another panel that's going to talk about the current policy of these platforms.